Sheriff Luke Carver rode his old gray horse across the desolate field, his breath turning into a thin mist that clung to the collar of his heavy coat. He was not patrolling out of duty, but because the loneliness that had haunted him since the war would not let him sleep. In the vast sea of white, a tiny dark speck made him pull the reins. At first, he thought it was a deer buried in the snow, but as he approached, his heart skipped a beat. It was an Apache woman. Her body was nearly buried beneath a thick layer of snow, her long black hair stiff from the cold, her broad shoulders covered in bruises. Torn ropes had left marks across her skin. Her lips were blue, and her breathing was faint, but it was still there, just enough to make him drop to his knees. Luke lifted her up. She was heavier than he expected. He looked around. There was nothing but wind, snow, and silence. No footprints, no one searching. He whispered, "You are alive. Hang in there." As he placed her on his horse, he felt a faint warmth coming from her body. Like a dying flame, he knew, if he left her, she would die. But if he brought her back, he would be inviting trouble from the entire town of Cold Ridge. And yet in that moment, the law meant nothing to him. There was only one simple truth. He could not leave her out in the snow, and that was the choice that changed his life forever. The blizzard howled through the night, as if it were trying to tear apart the roof of Luke Carver's old wooden cabin. Wind whistled through every crack in the walls, slapping against the windows like invisible hands. Inside the small house, the flickering firelight from the hearth danced across the aged wooden planks, casting shadows over a man bent close beside a bed. Nieli, the name he still did not know, lay motionless under a thick blanket. Her face was beautiful in a way that was fierce and untamed, the way only an Apache woman could be. High cheekbones, sharp features. But now all of it was covered in the pale purple of cold and exhaustion. Luke checked the rough bandages he had just wrapped around the wounds on her back and side. Whip marks, bruises, and torn skin. It was clear she had escaped from hell. He poured hot water into a small bottle and placed it near the foot of the bed to warm the air. Every movement was slow and gentle, as if even the smallest sound might shatter her. Near midnight, she jolted upright, not awake but panicked. Her body sprang up like a cornered animal, her eyes wide, dark, and full of terror. She grabbed the small knife Luke had left on the table, backing into the wall, her broad shoulders trembling. Luke raised both hands, his voice low and deep like the earth itself. "I am not going to hurt you. You are safe." But she did not believe him. Her strong body kept shaking, frozen with fear. Her eyes carried the hopelessness of someone who had been treated like a thing, hunted, betrayed by people. Luke slowly stepped back. He set the knife down, far from himself. Then he opened the door, letting the freezing wind rush in just to prove he was not keeping her prisoner. "If you want to leave, I will not stop you." His voice was honest, without a trace of deceit. She looked at the open door, at the black storm raging outside, then back at him. Slowly, very slowly. Her hand released the knife. That was the first signal. Luke stepped closer, but still kept his distance. He placed a bowl of hot soup on the floor and backed away 3 steps. "Eat. Not for me, but for yourself." She stared at him for a long time, so long that the fire in the hearth changed color twice. Finally, her trembling hand reached out and lifted the bowl. The rising steam wrapped around her face like a thin veil of life. In that moment, inside the cold wooden cabin, Luke understood that the snowstorm outside was only part of it. The storm inside her was far greater, and he would have to learn how to move gently through it. But he also understood one thing. Nieli had chosen to live, and she chose to live here, in his cabin. And their journey began in that quiet moment where the first spark of trust flickered like a tiny flame in the white night. The storm passed after 3 days and 3 nights, leaving behind a land as white as if it had just been born. Snow covered the cabin roof, the frozen ground, and even the wooden fence Luke had built back in the fall. The sky was a thick, silent blue, so still that the only sound was the crisp crunch of snow underfoot. Nieli stood by the window, her hand bandaged and calloused resting on the wooden frame. Light streamed in, highlighting the strong lines of muscle along her shoulder and arm. It was a kind of wild beauty, hardened by pain but never broken. Luke stood a few steps behind, watching quietly, careful not to startle her. He had come to understand that silence was the language she trusted most. When she tried to help despite her weakness, he spoke gently. "Take it slow. Your back is still healing." Nieli did not answer. She glanced at him, then walked toward the pile of unchopped wood. She picked up the axe to test its weight, but her strength had not yet returned, and the blade fell awkwardly into the snow. "Luke, step beside here. Let me." She gave a small shake of her head, a quiet, stubborn gesture from someone who had survived by her own hands. But when she saw that he did not grab the axe or insist, only waited with patience, she exhaled and stepped half a pace back. He split the wood. Each strike of the axe was steady and deep, the sound of cracking wood echoing through the white stillness like the rhythm of something solid and sure. Nieli watched for a long time, not out of surprise, but because it was the first time someone had worked for her, not used her. By evening, they made their first meal together. Luke sliced the meat while Nieli carefully peeled the potatoes, each motion slow, like someone learning to trust a life no longer ruled by violence. When she fumbled and dropped a potato, Luke bent to pick it up. She flinched and backed away, reacting as someone might who had been hit too many times. But Luke only smiled softly, saying nothing at all. That night, the wind whispered gently outside the porch. Nieli sat near the fireplace, her knees pulled up to her chest, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. Luke placed a cup of hot tea beside her, then stepped back as he always did. For the first time, she spoke. "Why did you help me?" Her voice was rough, like it had been locked away in darkness too long. Luke gave a slight shrug. "Because no one deserves to die alone in the snow." She said nothing, but her eyes shifted. That answer reached the deepest, coldest part of her heart. When a sudden gust rattled the cabin, she gasped, her breath short and sharp, remembering the ones who had hunted her. Luke moved slowly toward her, not touching her, just sitting close enough for his warmth to reach her. A long while passed before Nieli leaned her head back against the wall, just 2 finger widths from his shoulder. That space was small, but for her, it was a greater step than any path she had ever taken. And in the quiet of the snowy night, 2 people who had long lived alone began to learn how to breathe, side by side. By early March, the snow began to soften. The pale sun finally broke through after weeks of hiding behind the clouds, casting light on the icy ground like fresh scars on the earth. That was when Luke decided it was time to take Nieli into the town of Cold Ridge for supplies. Salt, leather, salves, things the cabin could not do without. Even though winter was far from over, Nieli stood in the doorway, eyeing the horse tied outside. Bruises still marked her neck and arms, but her solid frame had started to recover. Her eyes were wary, like every shadow might be hiding a hunter. Luke saw it in her and spoke gently. "I will be by your side the whole way. No one will lay a hand on you." She did not answer, but she took the leather coat he offered and followed him into the yard. The road into town stretched 4 miles, a white trail fading into the horizon. They rode together on one horse, not out of romance, but because Nieli was still too weak to ride alone. Seated behind him, her hands rested on the saddle, careful not to touch him. Luke could feel her breath behind him, trembling every time the cold wind cut through. When they reached Cold Ridge, silence hung thick in the air, like the frozen crust on the stream. The men outside the saloon stopped sweeping snow. A shopkeeper stared through her window, eyes wide. 2 children playing in the snow were immediately pulled inside by their mother. Every gaze fell on Nieli not with curiosity, but with fear and contempt. Luke had expected that, but Nieli had not. She stepped down from the horse, her shoulders shrinking instinctively, like a blade had been pressed to her throat. Townsfolk stepped back, staring at her like she carried disease. Luke walked close beside her, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver not as a threat, but as a warning. Inside the general store, Old Man Barnes looked at them like he had just seen the devil's shadow. "I do not sell to her kind," he said, pointing straight at Nieli. Luke answered with a voice low and steady, like stones dropping into a deep well. "You sell to me, she is with me." Barnes clenched his jaw but still picked up each item, his hands trembling slightly. Everyone in the store held their breath. A drunken cattle hand stumbled forward from the back, his smile twisted. "Carver, where'd you drag that trash from? That Apache girl ought to be." He never finished the sentence. Luke spun around, his eyes sharp as a drawn blade. His hand rested on his gun. "Watch your mouth. The store fell dead silent. The man backed away, stumbling like Luke's stare alone had shoved him. Nieli stood behind him. Her dark eyes narrowed slightly, not from fear, but from something else, something new. No one had ever stood up for her before. When they stepped back into the snow, the wind slashed across the yard. Luke helped her onto the horse without touching her more than absolutely necessary. The entire town watched them, but he met every single eye. On the ride back to the cabin, Nieli spoke softly, her voice rough like dry branches brushing against each other. Why? Stand up to them. For me? Luke looked straight ahead, his breath forming clouds in the air. Because you do not deserve their hatred. Because you are not a thing. She said nothing. But from behind him, he felt something shift, a breath no longer trembling. And her hand on the saddle moved just half a finger closer to him. In the cold of the western plains, that was the first real warmth he had felt from her. Thank you so much for being here. If this story brought back memories of dusty evenings, of hoofbeats echoing in your heart, then subscribe to my channel, so that every day we can sit together. And I will tell you another story from the West. That night, there was no snow, but the cold still slipped through every crack in the cabin walls like the fingers of an old winter. Luke sat by the fireplace, gently turning a cup of hot tea in his hands. The firelight cast weary shadows across his face, while across from him, Nieli sat cross-legged, a thick blanket wrapped tightly around her broad, strong shoulders. Since the day he had taken her into Cold Ridge, she had grown quieter. Her eyes often drifted toward the window, where the night lay heavy like old ash, as if she were watching for something that might return at any moment. Luke did not ask, but he understood. He had carried nights like that inside his own heart. It was not until the fire had burned low that Nieli finally spoke. Her voice was low, hoarse, like it had to be dug up from beneath layers of frozen stone. I was not born to die in the snow. Luke looked over. She had never started a story like that before. Nieli reached up and touched her neck, where the marks of the rope still lingered like a curse. They took me when summer was still green. She spoke each sentence like laying down stones. A group of traffickers. They laughed, spoke English, and called us meat for gold. A chill wind blew through the cabin. Luke set his tea down, saying nothing. I was sold twice. Her eyes stayed fixed on the fire, as if staring into memories glowing red-hot. First to a mining camp. Second, to a group of drunken men who wanted to test how much pain an Apache could take. Her voice did not shake, but her hands clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. I killed one of them, then ran. 3 days without sleep. Her breathing faltered. I thought dying in the snow would be better than going back to them. Luke felt his chest tighten, as if something unseen had wrapped around his ribs. But you did not die, he said softly. Nieli turned to look at him. Those black eyes, usually wild and sharp like mountain wind, now carried something softer, a kind of exhaustion that only came from running too long. Why did you save me? Her voice was strangely small. Luke leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and let out a long breath, as if trying to release a burden he had carried too long. Because I once carried someone I loved off a battlefield, he said. And I know. Some people have no one left to lift them up. Silence settled deep between them. Then Nieli moved closer, every step careful, as though she were walking across thin ice. She did not touch him, but she sat beside him close enough that he could hear her breath, slowly warming. With you, she whispered. It is the first time I am not running. It was not gratitude. It was surrender, something those who have had their souls torn apart rarely dare to give. Luke did not reach out to hold her. He only said one thing, low and solid like the timber walls of the cabin. Here, no one will hurt you again. Nieli slowly closed her eyes, and for the first time, her pain had a place to rest. That night, the northern wind rose from the valley, like the howl of a wild beast lost from its pack. Snow rolled off the cabin roof and slammed into the windows, creating long, eerie whistles that made the space feel like it was shrinking. Nieli sat close to the fireplace, the leather coat draped over her wide shoulders. The firelight flickered against her bronze skin, making her look like a living statue, strong, weary, and hauntingly beautiful. Luke stepped inside after locking the front door. He brushed snow from his shoulders and looked at her. She was trembling not from the cold, but from the sound of the wind. Each harsh gust made her shoulders tense, and her breath catch, like someone bracing for a blow. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "It is just the wind," Luke said gently, like calming a spooked horse. "There is no one here." Nieli did not answer, but her eyes flashed with a fear that only comes after too much pain. Another gust struck the wall hard. She shivered, clutching the blanket tighter in her hands. Luke knelt beside her, sitting close just near enough for his warmth to reach her. "Nieli, I am here." This time she turned to look at him. The firelight shimmered in her eyes like drops of midnight. Exhausted, wounded, but something else, too. The first flicker of trust. He raised his hand, pausing in midair, waiting for her permission. She did not flinch, did not close her eyes. She just looked at him, as if trying to see whether he would betray her like the others had. His fingers brushed gently against her cheek, where a faint scar traced from her cheekbone to her jawline. Nieli closed her eyes not from fear, but because she was letting go for the first time in years. In that moment, the space between them was no more than a breath, close enough that he could see every curve of her strong neck, every weary rise and fall of her chest. "Luke," she said his name so softly, it was like wind slipping through the trees. He leaned in, so slowly that their heartbeats could be heard blending with the storm outside. Their lips met not in hunger, not in fire, but like two survivors discovering warmth after a long, brutal winter. Nieli tilted her head, one hand resting on his chest, feeling the heat and the truth that he was really there. The kiss lingered, hesitant but deep, like two souls testing the ground to be sure it was not a dream. When they parted, Nieli rested her forehead against his. "I do not know how to trust." "Then trust a little at a time," he whispered. "I am not going anywhere." The storm still howled outside, but inside the small cabin, two people who had known only cold found warmth in each other. That night, they sat close until the fire burned low, not from desire, but because old fears were fading in the presence of something new. And it was the first night Nieli leaned into Luke's chest, like a woman who had finally found a place to shelter her heart. Spring came slowly to Cold Ridge. But when it arrived, the land exhaled, like it had been holding its breath beneath the snow. Melting snow trickled down the hillsides in quiet streams. The wind no longer carried its sharp bite but softened, bringing the scent of damp earth and fresh pine. Luke Carver's cabin stood at the edge of the woods, a tiny dot beneath a wide-open sky. But for the two people inside, it had become a home. Nieli woke before him each morning, stepping barefoot into the yard where dew still clung to the soil. She drew water from the well, wiped down the table, and repaired the wooden fence post by post. Her shoulders were broad, her arms strong as she lifted heavy logs, and Luke saw what others refused to. Resilience shaped like a woman. They worked together. They ate together. They shared warmth through the nights that still carried winter's chill. Over time, the cabin was no longer just a place to live, but a place to return to. But rumors moved faster than the spring breeze. Sheriff Carver is hiding an Apache. That woman used to be a slave, was sold more than once. No one knows how many she killed to escape. Then one afternoon, while Luke and Nieli were fixing the stable roof, a sudden flurry of crows rose from the direction of the main road. Luke knew instantly something was coming. 3 men on horseback stopped at the gate, one of them Blackstone. The saloon owner spat into the dirt. "Carver, you really letting that thing live with you?" He pointed straight at Nieli, his voice laced with disgust. "You're smearing filth on the whole damn town." Luke stepped down from the ladder, slowly brushing the dust off his hands. There was no smile in his eyes. "She has a name," Luke said, "and she lives here." The second man shouted, "The Apache have killed plenty. A woman like her should be hanging from a rope, not getting mercy." That stopped Nieli in her tracks. Her deep black eyes narrowed not from fear, but from a familiarity with words like that. Luke stepped forward, standing directly in front of them. His hands never touched his gun, but his stance alone made the 3 men instinctively take half a step back. "Anyone who wants to touch her," his voice was low and sharp, like forged steel, "will have to step over my dead body first." The spring wind passed through, carrying the whispers of the forest. Blackstone's eyes widened. "You would turn against the whole town for some Apache?" Luke did not blink. "I stand against evil, no matter what face it wears." His words fell like an oath carved in stone. The 3 men stood in silence, then turned their horses and rode off, hooves slapping into the mud. When they were gone, Nieli stood beneath the porch, her hand trembling not from fear, but from something deeper. She stepped closer, eyes dark as a summer night. "Why did you do that?" Luke looked at her for a long moment. "Because you are my woman." Nieli took a long breath, as if something invisible had just been lifted from her chest. In the soft spring light, she stood beside him, not a fugitive, not a frightened woman anymore, but a part of this home. And from that moment on, their bond was no longer a secret. It was a declaration. On this land, under this sky, they belonged to each other. That spring came slow to the land, but when it arrived, it was as if the earth shed its old skin. Snow pulled back from the base of the hills, revealing soft brown soil like the first breath of life. The little stream near the forest edge thawed and bubbled again, like a song the West had hidden all winter long. Luke Carver's cabin, once just a shelter for a lonely man, now looked different. There were clothes hanging on the porch. The sound of chopping wood echoed each morning. The smell of stew drifted through the air, and footsteps moved back and forth inside. And there was Nieli. She stood in the yard beside a small garden bed they had just built, planting the season's first sprouts with a shovel in her hand. Her broad shoulders cast a long shadow across the earth. Her black hair spilled down her back like a stream of night. She looked like a warrior, yet her movements were gentle, almost tender. Luke stood in the doorway, leaning on the wooden frame, watching her for a long while. He had never imagined that a life once filled with nothing but gunfire and solitude could ever bring him here. Nieli looked up, her deep eyes meeting his. "What are you staring at?" Her voice was low, with a flicker of shyness she could not quite hide. Luke stepped down from the porch, coming closer. "I'm looking at our home," he said with a truth so plain it made her pause. That word "our" was not a confession. It was a promise. Rumors still drifted through town. Some folks still whispered when Luke brought Nieli in to buy salt. Some turned away. But this time, fear no longer froze her heart. Because every time someone looked at her with contempt, Luke stepped forward half a step closer, like a wall of flesh and blood. One afternoon, as they were buying lumber to build an extra room, Reverend Caldwell approached them, his face hard as stone. "Sheriff, a man like you should not share a roof with the people we've bled fighting." Luke looked him dead in the eye. "She is not a people. She is a person." Then he turned his back, no apology, no explanation. Nieli saw everything, and for the first time in front of another soul, the faintest smile crossed her lips, something as rare as a January Sunday. By late spring, Luke finished the new room on the eastern side of the cabin. As she stood on the threshold, Nieli stopped, not because the room was beautiful, but because it was a room built for the future. "Who's this for?" she asked, her voice soft as the breeze. Luke stepped beside her, gently placing his hand on her back, not like a man claiming what was his, but like a man touching someone he loved. "For us," he said, "and for whatever may come after." Nieli looked at him for a long time. There was doubt, old pain, new hope, and something softer beginning to unfold in her deep eyes. She whispered, "I thought I would die in the snow, but I was reborn here." Luke pulled her into his arms as golden spring light poured over them. "And I found where I belong." The wind swept through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and the sound of water returning to life. In that little cabin at the end of the trail, two people once torn apart by the past had built a home not from wood, but from warmth, trust, and love. A love strong enough to outlast snow, wind, prejudice, and loneliness. They did not just live together. They belonged to each other. My friend, love does not ask what color your skin is, what tribe you come from, or how many scars your soul has carried. Love only chooses hearts brave enough to reach for each other, despite whispers and stares from the world, on a land filled with bullets and judgment. The love between a lonely sheriff and a wounded Apache woman proved that no wall, no winter, could keep two souls from finding each other. I am truly grateful you are here with me. I only hope that wherever you are listening from, you are safe and you are loved. I love you, my dear listeners of Wild West Storytelling. Tell me what you felt about this story. Leave a comment below. Type 1 if this story moved you. And don't forget to subscribe, so we can meet again in the next tale from the Wild, Wild West.